Have you ever wondered why, in a world overflowing with comforts, so many of us still feel empty? We live surrounded by dazzling lights, endless entertainment, instant gratification at the tip of our fingers. And yet, late at night, when the noise quiets down, there is often a hollow ache that whispers, "Is this all there is?" Modern life has taught us to chase after happiness as if it were a prize waiting at the finish line. We pursue wealth, recognition, the perfect body, the dream vacation, the next big purchase, believing each step will finally unlock joy. But strangely, the more we run, the further it slips away. Buddhism offers a radically different truth. It whispers that happiness is not hidden in distant horizons, but right here in the heart. And the greatest joy of all does not come from grasping, but from giving. From seeing another person smile, knowing we played a small part in that light. Think about it. Recall the last time you did something kind, not because you had to, but because your heart nudged you toward it. Maybe you helped a stranger carry heavy bags. Maybe you comforted a friend who was silently breaking inside. Maybe you donated to someone you'll never meet. Do you remember the warmth that filled your chest? That quiet, glowing satisfaction? That was not ordinary pleasure. That was joy, the kind that lingers long after the moment has passed. The Buddha often described this kind of happiness as a treasure that can never be stolen. Unlike wealth, it doesn't vanish. Unlike pleasure, it doesn't fade. The joy of helping others multiplies each time it's shared, like a flame lighting another flame without ever diminishing its own. But here's the paradox. Society rarely points us toward this treasure. We are trained to look for joy in possessions, power, or self-image. We are told that winning, having more, or standing above others will bring satisfaction. Yet history, psychology, and spiritual wisdom all reveal the same thing. Self-centered pursuits lead to endless craving, while compassion leads to peace. This isn't just ancient wisdom. Modern science is catching up. Researchers have discovered that when we give, when we help, when we act with kindness, our brains release oxytocin and dopamine, the very chemicals linked to happiness and connection. Neuroscientists call it the helper's high. The Buddha called it mudita, the joy of seeing others happy. Different words, same truth. Helping others unlocks a deeper form of happiness than anything money can buy. And yet, many of us overlook this path. Why? Because helping others doesn't always look glamorous. It doesn't fit the shiny, filtered images we scroll through on social media. It asks us to soften our hearts, to pause, to care. But in that quiet act of caring lies a doorway to the joy we've been searching for all along. In the teachings of Buddhism, compassion is not just a moral duty. It is a path to liberation. To see someone else's happiness as our own is to dissolve the walls of isolation we've built around ourselves. It is to realize that our lives are intertwined like waves upon the same ocean. And when one wave rises, the whole sea is lifted. So, as we begin this journey together, let us pause for a moment. Breathe. Reflect. What if the happiness we've been chasing all these years has been hiding in plain sight? What if the greatest treasure is not about what we can gain, but about what we can give? This is the hidden secret of joy, the kind that blooms not in taking, but in helping others find their own light. And as we explore deeper, you'll see how this timeless truth has been echoed across scriptures, across science, and across the human heart itself. We often believe that if we could just satisfy every desire, happiness would finally be ours. A better job, a bigger house, more likes, more money, more recognition, more. But here's the hidden trap. The moment we get what we wanted, the thrill quickly fades. The new phone becomes old in weeks. The applause dies down. The promotion soon feels like just another responsibility. And before long, our restless mind points us toward the next shiny object, whispering, maybe that will make you happy. This cycle is not an accident, it's the very nature of craving. Buddhism calls it tanha thirst, a thirst that can never be quenched no matter how much we pour into it. The Buddha taught that this thirst is the root of suffering because it tricks us into chasing shadows. Think of a child running after bubbles in the air. Each time a bubble is caught, it pops instantly. The joy is gone and the chase begins again. Our adult lives are not so different. We chase promotions, relationships, possessions, thinking they will last forever. But like bubbles, they burst in our hands, leaving us thirsty for the next one. This is the illusion of self-centered happiness, the belief that if we pile enough pleasures around the self will finally be content. Yet the self, as Buddhism points out, is like a hungry ghost. Its stomach vast, its throat narrow, never able to swallow enough to be full. And the more we center our lives on me, mine, I deserve, the lonelier we become. Have you noticed how fragile ego-based happiness really is? If someone criticizes us, it shatters. If someone has more than us, we feel envy. If we lose what we own, despair swallows us whole. A happiness that depends on conditions outside our control is a happiness that will always tremble in fear. But the Buddha's wisdom is compassionate, not condemning. He didn't say desires are evil. He simply revealed their nature. They are impermanent, unstable, unsatisfying. Like drinking salt water to quench thirst, craving promises relief but leaves us even more parched. And yet when we loosen our grip on me and mine, something remarkable happens. A space opens within us. Into that space flows kindness, compassion, and connection, the very things that bring true fulfillment. Consider this. The happiest moments in your life, were they when you got something for yourself or when you shared yourself with others? A laugh with a loved one, a quiet evening with a friend in need, the look of gratitude in someone's eyes when you offered help. These are not the highs of chasing, they are the depths of being. Modern society rarely teaches this. Advertisements shout, buy this, own that, and you'll be complete. Social media whispers, show more, prove more, and people will admire you. But Buddhism invites us to step off this endless treadmill, to see the illusion clearly, to recognize that the joy we seek cannot be owned, cannot be bought, cannot be clutched tightly in the hands of the self. The illusion of self-centered happiness is powerful, but illusions lose their hold the moment we awaken to them. An awakening begins with a question. What if true happiness is not about filling ourselves, but about emptying ourselves into others? As we begin to explore this deeper truth, another door opens. The Buddha's timeless insight into the nature of joy, a joy that blossoms the moment we step beyond the boundaries of the self. When the Buddha sat beneath the Bodhi tree and awakened to the nature of life, he did not promise a path of endless pleasures. He revealed something greater, a way out of the endless chase, a way into the joy that does not vanish. One of his most powerful insights was simple yet profound. True happiness is not diminished by being shared. In fact, it multiplies. Imagine a single candle lighting hundreds of others. The flame does not weaken. Instead, the light grows brighter, spreading warmth in every direction. The Buddha taught that when we cultivate metta, loving kindness, and mudita, the joy in seeing others happy, we touch a happiness far deeper than self-indulgence could ever provide. It is the happiness of a heart unchained from selfish craving. Think of the difference. Self-centered pleasure is like eating sugar. Sweet, yes, but it quickly fades, leaving us hungry for more. Compassionate joy is like nourishing food. It fills us in a way that sustains, grounding us with lasting contentment. The Buddha's life itself was a living example. After his enlightenment, he could have remained in silent bliss, detached from the world's struggles. But instead, he walked from village to village for 45 years, teaching, healing, and lifting others from suffering. His joy was not in isolation, but in seeing the suffering of others transformed into peace. And it wasn't only the Buddha. His disciples experienced the same. In the scriptures, there are countless stories of monks, nuns, and laypeople who discovered that generosity, kindness, and compassion brought a joy nothing else could rival. A wealthy merchant who gave food to the hungry found greater peace than he had ever known in his riches. A poor woman who offered a single flower at the Buddha's feet experienced a happiness that carried her through hardship. These stories point to the same truth. Joy arises not when the self is inflated, but when the self is transcended. When our hearts open wide enough to embrace the happiness of others as our own. And modern life, too, gives us countless reminders. A parent who sees their child laugh feels a joy that cannot be measured. A teacher who watches a struggling student finally succeed knows a fulfillment no paycheck could buy. A stranger who offers kindness to another, with no expectation in return, discovers a warmth that lingers long after. This is the Buddha's insight. The self is never truly satisfied by feeding itself. But when the self dissolves into compassion, into connection, into love, joy naturally blossoms. The world tells us that happiness is about standing above others. The Buddha tells us it is about standing with others. The world says, protect yourself first. The Buddha says, when you care for others, you are already caring for yourself because life is one great web of interdependence. This wisdom is not abstract philosophy. It is practical, experiential, alive, and it invites each of us to test it in the laboratory of our own hearts. Try it. Practice small acts of compassion. Cultivate joy for others, and watch how your own inner life begins to change. As this truth unfolds, another question arises. If compassion brings such deep joy, could it be that science, the very discipline that studies the mind and body, is beginning to confirm what the Buddha saw centuries ago? For centuries, the Buddha's teaching about joy and compassion was a spiritual truth, passed from teacher to student, written in palm leaf manuscripts, whispered in the quiet of monasteries. But today, science, armed with brain scans, psychology experiments, and biochemical research, is beginning to confirm what the Buddha saw with the eyes of awakening. When you help someone, something remarkable happens inside your body. Your brain releases oxytocin, the so-called bonding hormone which deepens trust and connection. Dopamine and endorphins flood the nervous system, creating what scientists call the helper's high. Your heart rate slows, your stress hormones decrease, and your sense of well-being expands. In other words, compassion is not only noble, it's natural. It is woven into our very biology. We are designed to find joy in giving, just as much as we are designed to hunger when we lack food or thirst when water is absent. Helping others is not a sacrifice of our happiness. It is one of its greatest sources. Think of the last time you gave a gift. Long after the wrapping paper was thrown away, wasn't it the smile on the receiver's face that stayed with you? Neuroscience now shows why. Our brains are wired to experience joy when others experience joy. In Buddhism, this is called mudita, or sympathetic joy. In science, it's called mirror neurons firing. Our nervous system literally mirrors the emotions of those around us. Studies in psychology echo the same truth. People who volunteer regularly report higher levels of life satisfaction, lower levels of depression, and even longer lifespans. One Harvard study found that people who spend money on others are consistently happier than those who spend the same amount on themselves. Generosity doesn't deplete us, it renews us. And perhaps most striking of all, compassion has ripple effects. A single act of kindness doesn't just impact the giver and receiver. Witnesses of kindness are inspired to be kind themselves, creating a chain reaction of goodness. Science calls this prosocial contagion. Buddhism calls it the natural spreading of merit and virtue. Different languages, same phenomenon. But why does this matter in our modern lives? Because we live in a world where stress, anxiety, and loneliness have become epidemics. We scroll endlessly, consume endlessly, compete endlessly, yet feel emptier than ever. The Buddha warned of this trap long ago. When we chase selfish cravings, we remain unsatisfied. Science now reveals the antidote. Compassion reduces stress, eases anxiety, strengthens immunity, and even heals the heart, literally and spiritually. Helping others is not just an act of morality. It is medicine. Medicine for the soul, medicine for the community, medicine for the planet. And here's the beauty. Compassion doesn't require grand gestures. Holding the door for someone, listening without judgment, offering a word of encouragement. These small moments create measurable shifts in both brain and heart. They remind us that the power to heal the world is already in our hands. The Buddha once said, "If you light a lamp for someone else, it will also brighten your path." Science now proves this is not just poetry. It's physiology, it's psychology, it's reality. And as we begin to understand this profound unity between ancient wisdom and modern research, another layer reveals itself. The timeless stories that illustrate how selfless giving has always been the wellspring of joy. These stories, carried across generations, speak louder than data because they touch us not only in the mind but in the heart. Sometimes the deepest truths are not understood through theories or even through science, but through stories. Stories that slip past the mind and land directly in the heart. Buddhism is filled with such stories. Tales of ordinary people, monks, kings, and even the Buddha himself, who discovered that the greatest joy is born in the act of giving. These are not just legends. They are mirrors, showing us what compassion looks like when lived fully. One of the most moving comes from the Jataka tales, the stories of the Buddha's past lives. In one life, the Bodhisattva came across a starving tigress, so weak she could not even feed her cubs. Faced with her suffering, he felt a compassion so vast it dissolved every trace of fear or hesitation. Without a thought for himself, he offered his own body so that the tigress and her cubs might live. It is a story both haunting and luminous. Haunting because of its sacrifice, luminous because of its lesson. The depth of joy that arises when love becomes boundless, when the self is no longer the center. Not every act of giving needs to be so dramatic to carry truth. In another tale, the Buddha, still a prince, once gave away his chariot, his wealth, and even his royal robes to those in need, finding far more joy in generosity than in luxury. These stories remind us that joy does not come from possession but from release, not from hoarding but from sharing. And even after his enlightenment, the Buddha himself lived this truth. He owned almost nothing, just a robe and a bowl. Yet he walked for decades, offering the richest gift of all, wisdom, compassion, and guidance, to anyone who would listen. Kings bowed before him, not because of wealth or power, but because of the radiant joy he carried, the joy of a man who had given everything and yet lacked nothing. But it's not only in ancient texts that we find such examples. History and modern life are filled with people who live by the same truth. Think of Mother Teresa, cradling the sick in the streets of Calcutta. Think of doctors who travel to disaster zones, risking their lives to heal strangers. Think of volunteers who spend nights in soup kitchens, not for money or fame, but for the simple joy of seeing another human being cared for. Perhaps you have your own story too. A time you gave something, your time, your attention, your help, and felt a happiness that surprised you with its depth. A happiness that didn't fade when the moment ended, but lingered in your chest like a quiet flame. These stories matter because they remind us of who we truly are. Beneath the layers of ambition and fear, there is a natural impulse within every human being. The impulse to care, to give, to connect. The Buddha's teachings simply guide us back to that place, to show us that in helping others, we awaken the very essence of joy itself. And what's most remarkable is this: giving doesn't diminish us, it expands us. When we open our hands, our hearts grow wider. When we share what we have, we realize how much we truly possess. In this expansion, in this selfless offering, joy flows freely, unbound by conditions. So the stories tell us something simple but revolutionary. Happiness is not found in grasping tighter, but in letting go. Not in building walls around ourselves, but in breaking them down so that love can flow outward. And when we see these truths reflected in story after story, a deeper understanding begins to arise, that helping others is not just a noble choice. It is the very nature of life itself. For we are not separate islands, but waves rising and falling in the same vast ocean. To lift another is to lift ourselves. When we hear stories of selfless giving, we might admire the courage, but deep inside, a quiet question often arises. Why should I sacrifice my own comfort for someone else? Doesn't joy come from taking care of myself first? The Buddha's answer is profound and simple at once. There is no true separation between self and other. What we do for others, we ultimately do for ourselves. This is the principle of interconnectedness, known in Buddhism as pratityasamutpada, or dependent origination. Imagine a tree. At first glance, it seems like an independent thing, standing tall, rooted in the ground, but look closer. That tree exists only because of sunlight, rain, soil, and air. Even the seed that began its life came from another tree. Take away the sun and it dies. Take away the water and it withers. The tree is not truly separate. It is a network of countless conditions. Now consider yourself. You are here because of your parents, your ancestors, the food you eat, the air you breathe, the countless people who farmed, transported, and prepared that food. Even your thoughts are shaped by teachers, books, conversations, and cultures. In truth, there is no isolated me. There is only a vast web of connections. This is why helping others is never just about them, it's about us too. When the environment thrives, we thrive. When communities are healthy, we are healthy. When we bring joy to another heart, it reflects back into our own. Think of laughter. You can't laugh alone for long, it blooms in connection. A joke lands, a smile spreads, and suddenly the room is filled with warmth. Joy moves like ripples on a pond, touching one circle, then another, until the whole surface is alive with motion. Modern science echoes this truth. Studies on social connection reveal that happiness spreads through networks, almost like an emotional contagion. If you help a friend feel good today, their uplifted mood will ripple outward, touching their family, their co-workers, even strangers. And eventually that wave comes back to you. We are not solitary beings, we are mirrors reflecting each other constantly. But Buddhism goes even deeper. It teaches that clinging to a rigid sense of I and mine is the root of suffering. When we realize the self is not a solid, separate entity but a fluid, interdependent process, compassion naturally arises. Why? Because harming you is harming me. Helping you is helping me. The boundary dissolves. This is why the joy of compassion feels so natural. It is an alignment with reality itself. It's like stepping into a river's current instead of fighting against it. Life flows more smoothly when we move with the truth of interconnection. And here's something remarkable. The more we give, the more we realize we are never truly losing. Share kindness and you feel lighter, not poorer. Offer love and your heart expands instead of empties. Generosity is not subtraction, it is multiplication. Perhaps this is why people who dedicate themselves to others often radiate a happiness that feels unshakable. They are not chasing fleeting pleasures, they are living in harmony with the great web of life. And in that harmony, joy arises naturally. But of course, knowing this truth doesn't mean living it is always easy. Our ego resists. Fear whispers, if I give too much, I'll have nothing left. Doubt warns, people will take advantage of me. The next step on this journey is to look honestly at those obstacles, the barriers that prevent compassion from flowing freely, and discover how the Buddha's wisdom helps us move through them. If compassion is so natural, if helping others truly brings us joy, then why do we so often hold back? Why, in moments when we could give, do we sometimes turn away? The truth is, while the heart leans toward generosity, the mind often throws up walls. These walls take many forms: fear, doubt, pride, even weariness. And unless we recognize them, they quietly keep us locked in the prison of self. One of the most common obstacles is fear of being taken advantage of. We wonder, if I give too much, will people exploit me? Will I be left with nothing? It's a reasonable fear. The ego is built to protect itself. But here lies the paradox. When we give only cautiously, calculating every return, we never taste the sweetness of true generosity. Compassion asks for trust, not blind trust in people, but deep trust in the law of life, that what we give from sincerity will in some form return. Another obstacle is the weight of ego. The self whispers, why should I help them? What about me? Don't I deserve more? This inner voice convinces us that happiness is a scarce resource, something to be hoarded. But Buddhism teaches the opposite. Happiness grows by sharing. A smile given multiplies. A kindness offered spreads. When we believe joy is limited, we shrink. When we see it as infinite, we expand. There is also cynicism and doubt. In a world filled with corruption, betrayal, and disappointment, compassion can feel naive. We think, my small act won't change anything. People won't really care. The world is too broken. Yet history is filled with proof that even the smallest act can ripple across generations. A single kind word can save a life. A single act of generosity can spark a chain reaction of goodness. Compassion may not solve everything at once, but it always plants a seed. Sometimes the obstacle is weariness, what we might call compassion fatigue. Life is demanding, and when we are exhausted, giving feels impossible. The Buddha understood this, which is why he taught balance. Compassion does not mean burning ourselves out. It means finding a steady rhythm, caring for others while also nurturing our own well-being. When the candle of our heart grows dim, we must rest and relight it so that it can continue to shine. And then there is pride, the subtlest obstacle of all. Sometimes we give not out of pure compassion, but to feel superior, to prove our worth, or to gain recognition. This is not true giving, but another mask of ego. The Buddha warned that the joy of compassion arises only when the self dissolves. True generosity is humble, quiet, free of the need to be seen. Each of these obstacles is real and each can feel heavy. But Buddhism offers a way through: awareness. By shining the light of mindfulness on our fears, doubts, and ego, we begin to loosen their grip. We don't have to fight them. We simply have to see them clearly, and they begin to fade. Compassion is not about being perfect. It is about being present. It is about opening the heart even when the mind resists. Step by step, act by act, we learn that these obstacles are not walls but illusions. And behind the illusions lies a joy beyond measure. Because once we move past fear and doubt, once we let compassion flow freely, we discover something extraordinary. The joy that comes from helping others is deeper, richer, and more enduring than any pleasure the self could ever grasp. It is a joy that expands with each act, a joy that no loss can diminish. And so the path continues, leading us into that boundless joy, the kind the Buddha described as the highest form of happiness. There is a kind of joy that is fleeting, like the sweetness of sugar on the tongue, gone as quickly as it arrives. And then there is another kind of joy, deeper, quieter, yet infinitely more fulfilling. A joy that grows the more it is shared and never fades with time. This is the joy of compassion, the joy beyond measure. Think of it. The pleasure of a new possession wears off. The thrill of achievement fades. Even the delight of praise can vanish with a single criticism. But the memory of helping someone in their darkest hour, that joy stays with you. It softens the heart. It strengthens the spirit. It becomes a part of who you are. The Buddha understood this well. He taught that self-centered pleasures are like chasing shadows. They can never truly satisfy. But the joy of compassion is like light. It shines outward, illuminating others, and in doing so, it warms the giver as well. In Buddhist tradition, this is called the boundless joy, a joy that grows precisely because it is not confined to the self. Science now confirms what the sages have always known. Compassion activates parts of the brain linked not only to happiness, but to lasting fulfillment. Unlike temporary pleasures, compassion creates a steady glow within the mind, a kind of emotional resilience. Those who live with compassion are not free from suffering, but they are anchored in a joy that suffering cannot destroy. Stories across cultures echo this truth. The mother who sacrifices for her child and feels no loss but only love. The stranger who gives without expecting thanks and finds their heart unexpectedly lifted. The monk who spends his life in service, radiating a peace that no wealth could ever buy. Each points to the same reality. There is a joy in compassion that transcends circumstance. And this joy is not limited to saints or sages. It is available to us all. The moment we step outside the prison of self-concern and open our hearts to others, we taste it. Whether it is through listening, forgiving, or simply offering a smile, we are reminded of our deepest nature, the nature that longs to connect, to love, to give. This joy is beyond measure because it cannot be taken away. Possessions can be lost, status can be stripped, health can decline, but no one can take from you the joy of having loved, of having helped, of having made the world a little brighter for another being. And here lies the secret. When you live in compassion, you no longer chase happiness. Happiness finds you. It flows through you like a river, quiet yet unstoppable. It carries you beyond the narrow boundaries of me and mine, into the vast ocean of we. This is why the Buddha called compassion one of the greatest treasures. It is not something you must search for outside yourself. It is something you awaken within. And once it is awakened, it becomes a fountain that never runs dry. The joy beyond measure is the proof that the highest form of happiness is not about what we have. It is about what we give. And when we live this way, every act of kindness, no matter how small, becomes a doorway to liberation. As we begin to see this truth more clearly, another question arises. How do we carry this spirit of compassion into the everyday? Not only in moments of inspiration, but in the ordinary rhythm of our lives. Compassion, when spoken of, can sound lofty, something reserved for monks, saints, or extraordinary moments of sacrifice. But the truth is, compassion is meant to be lived in the small, ordinary steps of our daily lives. It is not something far away. It is something we can practice every morning when we wake, every evening before we rest, and in countless moments in between. So how do we bring compassion down from the clouds of philosophy and into the ground of everyday living? The first step is listening deeply. Too often we hear only enough to respond, but true compassion listens without agenda, without rushing to fix, without judgment. The next time someone speaks, try pausing. Let their words settle. Look not only at what they say, but at what they feel. Sometimes, giving someone space to be heard is the greatest act of kindness we can offer. Second, we can practice small acts of generosity. Compassion does not always require grand gestures. A warm smile to a stranger, holding the door open, offering a sincere compliment, sharing a meal. These may seem small, but they carry weight far beyond their size. Like ripples in water, they spread outward in ways we cannot see. Third, cultivate patience in the face of irritation. Daily life presents endless chances to lose our temper. A long line at the store, a careless driver, a coworker who frustrates us. In those moments, compassion whispers, "This person is human just like me. They struggle just like me. They wish to be happy just like me." By remembering this, we transform annoyance into understanding and ordinary moments into opportunities for practice. Another powerful practice is forgiveness. Carrying resentment is like holding a burning coal. It burns us more than it burns the other. Forgiveness does not mean ignoring harm or excusing injustice. It means releasing the poison of hatred from our own hearts. Every time we let go of anger, we make space for compassion to enter. We can also live with compassion through mindful awareness. In Buddhism, mindfulness is not only about sitting in meditation. It is about bringing gentle awareness to every action. When we eat, we can pause to remember the countless hands that brought food to our table. When we use water, we can remember that others thirst. This awareness naturally blooms into gratitude, and gratitude is the soil in which compassion grows. Another daily practice is offering encouragement. Words carry incredible power. A kind word at the right time can lift someone from despair. We often underestimate this. Yet to tell someone, "I believe in you," or "you are not alone," is to plant seeds of strength that may bloom long after we are gone. And finally, we must remember compassion for ourselves. Too many people believe compassion is only for others, but if we neglect ourselves, we soon run dry. Self-compassion is not selfishness, it is self-care. To rest when tired, to forgive our mistakes, to speak kindly to ourselves. These acts keep our hearts open so we can continue to serve others. When we weave these practices into the fabric of our days, compassion stops being an idea and becomes a way of being. It is no longer something we do occasionally. It becomes the rhythm of our lives. Imagine a world where each of us lived this way, listening deeply, forgiving freely, offering kindness without condition. Imagine the peace, the trust, the joy that would bloom. That world begins not with governments, not with institutions, but with us, right here, right now, in the choices we make each day. This is how compassion moves from theory to reality, from dream to practice. And when we live this way, our lives themselves become the teaching, our actions the sermon, our joy the proof that compassion is the highest path. As we carry these practices into daily life, something beautiful happens. Compassion no longer feels like effort. It becomes who we are. And when compassion becomes who we are, we touch the very heart of what the Buddha called liberation. There comes a moment after all the stories, the teachings, the practices, when the truth stands quietly before us. The greatest joy is not found in chasing our own happiness, but in helping others discover theirs. Throughout this journey, we have seen how compassion transforms not only those who receive it, but also those who give it. We've walked through the illusions of self-centered happiness, touched the Buddha's timeless insight, explored the science of compassion, and witnessed the living stories of generosity that echo through the ages. We've faced the obstacles that hold us back and uncovered the boundless joy that waits when we move beyond them. We've learned that compassion is not a distant ideal, but a daily practice, woven into the smallest gestures, the simplest choices, the quietest acts of kindness. And now, as we bring this journey to a close, a new beginning unfolds, because every ending in the Dharma is only an opening into practice. The Buddha once said, "Thousands of candles can be lit from a single candle, and the life of the candle will not be shortened." Happiness never decreases by being shared. This is the essence of becoming a light for the world. To be a light does not mean to be perfect, flawless, or grand. It means to shine in whatever way we can, right where we are. A kind word to someone in pain, a hand extended to someone in need, a moment of forgiveness where anger could have ruled. Each of these is a flame that pushes back the darkness. And here lies the miracle. When we live with compassion, we do not merely change lives, we change the world. Not in a sudden explosion of glory, but in the gentle glow that spreads from heart to heart, from act to act, from day to day. This is how peace is built. This is how humanity heals. You may never see the full impact of your kindness. You may never know how far the ripples of your compassion reach. But know this, every light you kindle matters. Every act of compassion lives on, shaping lives you may never meet, echoing into a future you may never see. So, as you step back into the rhythm of your daily life, carry this truth within you. You are not powerless. You are not small. Within you burns a flame that can brighten even the darkest corner of the world. Become that flame. Live in compassion. Share in joy. And in doing so, you will discover what the Buddha and countless beings before us have discovered. that the highest happiness is found not in receiving but in giving. This is the joy beyond measure. This is the hidden treasure revealed. This is the light you were born to share. If these words have touched something within you, if you felt even a spark of stillness, clarity, or joy while listening, then I invite you to stay on this journey with us. Here, on Zen Buddhism Wisdom, we share timeless teachings, practical insights, and stories that help us walk the path with mindfulness, compassion, and understanding. If this resonated with you, consider subscribing to the channel, not just to follow content, but to walk together as a community, learning and growing in the Dharma. Leave a comment and share your reflections, because your voice may be the light that inspires someone else. And if you feel called, share this video with a friend who may need it today. May you carry this flame of compassion into your daily life. And may your journey be filled with peace, joy, and the wisdom of the Buddha.